47,000 souls, 23 ships. That is all that remains of an empire that once spanned 400 star systems. And in exactly 6 minutes, the number will be 0. Commander VTH gripped the edge of the command console until her claws bit into the metal. On the view screen of the flagship Solemn Vigil, a wall of red contact points stretched from one horizon of space to the other, a machine fleet uncountable, patient, and utterly without mercy. The Zios had found them again. They always found them. For 300 years, the Korani had run. They had once been a civilization of philosophers and star cartographers, a people who mapped the galaxy for the joy of knowing it. Then the Zios arrived. Not an empire, not a species, but a spreading machine intelligence that consumed every world it touched and turned the wreckage into more of itself. World after world had fallen silent. Colony after colony had gone dark. Now only 23 ships remained, carrying the last living memory of what the Korani used to be. Systems report, VTH said, her voice flat with the exhaustion of 100 such nights. Shields at 12% on the Vigil. The Ash Wreath just lost main power. Her second-in-command, Oriai, did not look up from his display. We cannot outrun them, Commander. We never could. That was the first blow of the night. Not a weapon, but a truth finally spoken aloud. For years, the Korani fleet had told itself a story, that somewhere ahead was a hiding place, a nebula deep enough, a dead system empty enough, that the Zios would lose the scent. Oriai's words ended that story in 6 words. There was nowhere left to run. VTH watched the tactical display as 3 of her escort ships peeled away to form a rear guard, a maneuver everyone aboard understood without being told. They were buying time with their lives so the refugee transports could limp a little further into the dark. It would not be enough. It was never enough. But it was what remained to do. Then came the second blow. The rear guard cruiser Talvain, the ship that carried the last surviving fragment of the Korani archive, 3,000 years of art, language, and memory compressed into crystal lattice, took a direct hit across its reactor core. VDH watched the ship bloom into silent white fire on the screen. There was no sound in the vacuum, only the light, and then nothing where a ship used to be. The archive, Oriai said quietly, "It's gone." VTH said nothing. Their losses too large for words, and this was one of them. Something in her chest went very still, the particular stillness of someone who has run out of grief and is now simply waiting. The Zios fleet closed the distance. Weapon locks chimed across every console on the bridge, a chorus of small bells announcing the end. VTH found herself thinking, absurdly, of a garden on her homeworld that no longer existed, of the sound rain made on leaves that had burned to ash centuries ago. And then, without warning, without any signature the sensors could explain, space itself seemed to fold. A ship appeared. It had not decelerated from translite, had not dropped out of a wormhole in any pattern the Korani database recognized. It was simply there, occupy a point in space that had been empty a heartbeat before. It was vast, dark, and utterly unfamiliar, its hull a deep matte black that seemed to swallow the weapon fire already lighting up the void around it. Identify that vessel. VTH snapped. Scanning, Commander. I have no match. It isn't Zios. It isn't anything in our records. Oriai's voice cracked with something between terror and disbelief. It just arrived. The bridge fell silent, except for the dying chime of weapon locks. Every eye turned to the screen, to the black shape hanging silently between the Korani refugees and their executioners, as if deciding whether to let the slaughter continue. Then the ship moved, and for the first time in 300 years, the machine fleet that had never once slowed its advance began impossibly to fall back. Nobody on the Solemn Vigil understood what they were looking at. Nobody yet knew the name of the species aboard that ship, or that Commander VTH was about to hear a word she had not spoken in centuries. The name of a people Korani once catalogued, studied, and dismissed as too primitive to matter. Humanity had returned, and it was no longer what the Korani remembered. The black ship did not hail them. It did not announce itself, did not request identification, did not do any of the things a rescuer was supposed to do. It simply moved forward into the heart of the Zios formation, 300,000 machine vessels arranged in a hunting pattern that had annihilated 41 Korani colonies without ever losing that shape, and began to unmake it Commander VTH watched the tactical display with her mouth open, unable to process what her own sensors were reporting. The unknown ship was not maneuvering to escape. It was maneuvering to engage. Alone, against 300,000. That's insane, Ori whispered. One ship cannot. The first volley from the black vessel answered him. It was unlike any weapon signature in the Korani archive. Not the clean plasma lances the Korani themselves once wielded, not the crude kinetic barges of 100 other doomed species. This was something stranger, beams of corrupted light that didn't simply destroy the Zio ships they touched, but unraveled them, causing entire squadrons to disintegrate into their own component parts, as though the weapon spoke the machine's own language and ordered them to stop existing. That was the first turning point of the night. The realization, dawning slowly across the bridge of the solemn vigil, that they were not witnessing a rescue. They were witnessing a hunt. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the Korani were not the prey. Commander, Oriai's voice had gone strange. I have a match. The registry markers on that hull. Commander, that's a Terran design signature. VTH turned slowly. Terran, you mean? Human, Oriai confirmed. Commander, that is a human warship. The word landed on the bridge like a stone dropped into still water. Every officer present had studied the old catalogs, the surveys compiled back when the Korani still had the luxury of curiosity. Humanity had been a footnote in those records, a young, fractious, technologically unremarkable species confined to a single solar system, flagged as unlikely to survive contact with any serious galactic threat, let alone the Zios. The Korani had not thought of them in 100 years. They had certainly never imagined this. On the screen, the human ship, its hull now visible as it banked to the collapsing Zios formation, carved a path of annihilation nearly 40 kilometers wide. Machine hulks tumbled through space, some sheared clean in half, others simply gone dark, their animating intelligence severed from whatever process had once controlled them. In less time than it had taken the Korani rear guard to die minutes earlier, a third of the Zios fleet had ceased to exist. That was the second turning point. Not just that humanity had survived, but that they had become something the Korani had no framework to understand. Not survivors, not refugees, predators. A channel open on the Vigil's communications array, uninvited, humming with a frequency protocol older than any encryption VDH recognized, as though the ship on the other end had simply reached in and taken control of the connection rather than asking for one. Korani vessels. The voice was a woman's, calm in a specific way of someone who has stopped being frightened of anything a long time ago. This is Captain Valeria Rourke of the Audacity. Hold position. We are not finished. VTH found she could not immediately answer. On the screen, the Audacity turned its full attention toward the Zios command cluster at the heart of the formation. The coordinating nodes had directed the machine swarm's every maneuver and tore into them with a ferocity that did not look like war. It looked like vengeance perfected into a science. Within 11 minutes, of the 300,000 machine vessels that had come to erase the last of the Korani people, less than 4,000 remained, scattering into dark in what VDH's sensors registered almost unbelievably as retreat. The Zios did not retreat. The Zios had never once retreated in 300 years of recorded contact. That was a third turning point, the one that would haunt VTH long after this night. Watching an enemy that had never known fear finally learn it, at the hands of a single alien ship crewed by a people Korani had once judged unworthy of notice. The channel crackled again. Commander VDH of the Solemn Vigil, Valeria Rourke said, and there was something almost gentle beneath the iron in her voice now, as if she had read the shock on Korani faces from across the vacuum of space. You're safe. For now, prepare to receive a boarding party. We have a great deal to discuss about the Zios, about your people, and about what's coming next. VTH looked at Ori. Neither of them had words for what they had just witnessed. Somewhere behind that black hole was a species of Korani had once dismissed as primitive, and it had just done, alone, what the entire Korani war fleet had failed to do in 3 centuries of trying. She keyed the comm open. Received. Standing by. She did not yet know that the conversation had come would change not only the fate of her people, but the fate of the galaxy itself. The boarding party from the Audacity did not look like conquerors, and that unsettled commander VTH more than if they had. They moved through the solemn vigil's corridors with the quiet economy of people who had long ago stopped wasting motion, their eyes scanning every doorway and junction out of habit rather than suspicion. At their head walked Captain Valeria Rourke herself, a woman of perhaps 40 standard years, her face marked with the kind of stillness that VTH had only ever seen before in Korani elders who had outlived everyone they loved. "Commander," Rourke inclined her head, a gesture of respect that seemed almost incongruous next to the devastation her ship had just wrought. "Thank you for trusting the hail. You destroyed a fleet that has hunted my people for 300 years, VTH said carefully, in under 15 minutes. Forgive me if trust is not yet the correct word. Something flickered across Rourke's expression, not offense, but a kind of tired recognition. Fair, she said. Let me offer you something better than trust, then. Truth. That was the first turning point of the meeting. The moment Rourke chose to answer questions the Korani had not even worked up the courage to ask yet. Humanity, Rourke explained, had encountered the Zios nearly 2 centuries after Korani first cataloged them as an unremarkable single-system species. The Zios had found Earth's solar system the way they found everything, methodically, patiently, treating an entire civilization as raw material to be processed. Humanity's first war against the Zios had lasted 61 years. It had cost them 14 billion lives, nearly their entire population at the time. Colonies glassed, homeworld cities turned to ash, an entire species standing at the very edge of the extinction the Korani now faced. We didn't win because we were strong, Rourke said quietly. We won because we stopped being what we were. Every ship in our fleet, every weapon we carry, built from Zios wreckage, using Zios logic turned against itself. We didn't defeat them. We became something that could survive them. VTH studied the captain's face and understood, with a chill, what that sentence meant. Rourke did not speak of victory the way a triumphant person speaks. She spoke of it the way someone describes an amputation that saved their life. That was the second turning point. Not the revelation of humanity's strength, but the cost buried beneath it. VTH had assumed the audacity represented salvation. She was beginning to understand it might represent a warning as well. Not everyone aboard the Korani fleet was willing to accept either. In the council chamber that evening, First Archivist Senoi rose before the assembled ship commanders, his voice sharp with a fear he did not bother to hide. We know nothing of these people beyond what they have shown us tonight, he said. A species capable of unmaking 300,000 machines in minutes is not a rescuer, commander. It is simply a different kind of danger. We would be trading one hunter for another. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. VTH understood the fear. She felt an echo of it herself, standing on the bridge as the audacity tore the void apart. But she had also seen something Senoi had not been present to witness. The particular grief in Valeria Rourke's eyes when she spoke of the 61 years humanity had bled for survival. That was not the expression of a predator. It was the expression of a people who remembered, painfully, what it had cost to become one. They could have let us die, VTH said finally, cutting through the debate. The Zios fleet was 30 seconds from finishing what 3 centuries of pursuit began. The audacity did not have to intervene. It chose to. That is not nothing, Archivist. That is the only nothing we've been offered in 300 years. It was the third turning point of the day. The moment VTH made her choice publicly, before her own council, to trust the strangers who had once been beneath her people's notice, and to stake the last of the Korani on that trust. That night, aboard the Audacity, Valeria Rourke laid out on a holographic display the true reason her ship had come looking for refugees at all. It was not chance. It was not charity. There is a place, Rourke said, at the exact center of Zios controlled space. We call it the core. It is the seat of the intelligence that directs every machine in that fleet. Every fleet like it, across 100 fronts. Destroy the core, and the Zios does a retreat. It dies. All of it, everywhere, all at once. Then why? VTH asked slowly. Have you not already done this? Rourke's jaw tightened. Because we don't have the coordinates. The Zios scrubbed every star chart that could lead to it centuries ago. Every human record, every colony archive, every surveying vessel that ever came close. But the Korani were cartographers once. You mapped 400 systems before we ever left our own solar system. She met VTH's eyes. We think your archives may hold pieces of the path we're missing. We didn't come looking for refugees to save. Commander, we came looking for the last people in the galaxy who might remember the way to end this war. Saving your fleet was not the mission. It was simply the right thing to do on the way to it. The chamber went very quiet. VTH thought of the Talvain and the archive it had carried, destroyed hours before the Audacity ever arrived, and wondered, with a cold and sinking dread, whether the very knowledge humanity needed had burned to ash in that reactor fire, moments too soon to be saved. The dread did not last. 2 days after the rescue, a junior archivist named Ilian, barely more than a cadet, assigned to the refugee transport Windward, approached Commander VTH with a data crystal clutched so tightly in both hands that her knuckles had gone pale. "Commander," Ilian said, "the Talvain was not the only ship carrying archive fragments. Standard doctrine, in case of exactly this. Redundant copies. I have the pre-collapse stellar cartography going back 1100 years. It's incomplete, but it's not nothing. That was the first turning point of the effort to come. The discovery, against all reasonable hope, that the knowledge humanity needed had survived after all, scattered and fragmentary, aboard a ship no one had thought to search first. Rourke did not celebrate when she heard. She simply nodded, the particular nod of someone who has learned not to trust good news until it has been tested. "Bring it aboard the Audacity," she said. "We'll need your cartographers and ours working the same table. This will not be simple." It was not simple. For 11 days, Korani star mappers and human tacticians worked side by side in a converted cargo bay aboard the Audacity, cross-referencing 11 centuries of Korani survey data against fragments of Zio's supply route intelligence humanity had bled to acquire over 200 years of war. The two cultures did not always understand one another. Korani cartography spoke in the poetic long-form notation of scholars who had once mapped stars for their own sake. Human tactical data spoke in the clipped, brutal shorthand of a species that had learned to read a star chart the way a soldier reads a minefield. But slowly, argument by argument, the two languages began to translate into something new. It was Ilian, in the end, who found it. A gap in the Zio's exclusion zone data that corresponded almost exactly to an ancient Korani survey marker abandoned 600 years before the war ever began, back when the Zios were merely a rumor at the edge of Korani space. "Here," she said, voice shaking. "This is it. This has to be it. There's a system here the Zios avoid entirely. Not because it's defended, because it's empty, deliberately, on every map they've ever produced. You don't erase something that isn't important." Rourke studied the coordinates for a long moment. "We've had probes vanish near that sector for a decade. We assumed it was a dead zone." She looked up, and for the first time since the Korani had met her, something like genuine hope crossed her face. "We assumed wrong." That was the second turning point. Not the finding of the coordinates alone, but the first real crack in humanity's own certainty. The first sign that 2 centuries of grinding, joyless war might be approaching its end. But knowledge was not the same as victory, and first archivist Senoi made certain the Council did not forget it. "You would have us throw the last 23 ships of our civilization at the heart of an enemy fortress," he said, based on 600-year-old survey notes, and the word of a captain who has known us for 11 days. "I would have us in the war that has hunted us for 3 centuries, VTH answered, "using the only chance we are ever likely to be given. And if it fails, if the coordinates are wrong, or the defenses at the core are beyond even the Audacity's strength, we will have spent the last of our people on a single roll of the dice." It was Rourke, standing quietly at the edge of the council chamber, who answered him instead of VTH. "Archivist, I will not pretend this is safe. I will not pretend humanity's fleet, the whole of it, not just my ship, can guarantee your survival at the core. I can only tell you what we know for certain. If the Zios are never stopped, this exact council chamber, this exact fear, will simply repeat itself in another refugee fleet and another until there is no one left in this galaxy to hold it." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of commanders who had spent their lives fleeing rather than fighting. "You have already lost everything running. I am asking you to risk what remains, once, on the chance of never running again. The chamber fell silent. VTH watched Senoi's face, watched the anger and grief and exhaustion move across it in equal measure, and understood that the council's decision would rest, in the end, not on tactics, but on whether a people who had defined themselves by survival could still choose to fight. Senoi did not vote that night, but 3 days later, when the combined Human-Korani War Council convened to finalize the assault plan, he stood among the commanders who volunteered their ships. Not because I believe we will win, he told VTH quietly, before the meeting began. Because I believe Ilian deserves a chance to see whether her discovery mattered. That was the third turning point. Not a victory, not even confidence. Simply the moment an entire fractured, frightened people chose together to stop running. Behind them, the human fleet began to gather. 91 ships answered Rurk's call across a dozen fronts, converging on a rendezvous point at the edge of Zio space. The largest assembly of humanity's war fleet in over a decade, drawn together for a single, final purpose. 23 Korani ships took their place alongside them, small and battered next to the black holes of humanity's war machine, but present, willing. The path to the core was set. What waited at the end of it, no one, human or Korani, could yet say. The rendezvous point looked, for one brief and unbearable hour, like hope. 91 human warships hung in formation against the black, their hulls catching starlight the color of old iron, and alongside them the 23 surviving Korani vessels, patched, scarred, and impossibly still flying. Commander VDH stood on the bridge of the solemn vigil and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 centuries, to imagine an ending to the war that was not extinction. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took the combined fleet to cross into the marked exclusion zone. Commander, Oriai's voice was tight. Sensors are picking up Zio's signatures. A lot of them. This isn't a dead zone, it's a garrison. The first turning point of the battle arrived before a single shot was fired. The realization that the core was not lightly guarded because it was forgotten, but because whatever defended it had never needed to advertise its strength. Nearly 500,000 Zio's vessels rose from concealment around a structure unlike anything in either species' records, a construct the size of a small moon, its surface writhing with lattices of dark energy that pulse in slow, patient rhythm, like something breathing. That's not a fortress, Rurk said over the combined command channel, her voice for the first time betraying something close to alarm. That's a nest. All fleets converge on the core directly. Do not engage the garrison ships individually. You will be overwhelmed. We go for the heart or we go nowhere. The battle that followed defied every account the Korani archives held of warfare. Human ships tore forward in tight formation, weapons cutting corridors of ruin to the Zio's garrison, while the smaller, more fragile Korani vessels wove through the gaps their allies opened, racing toward a target none of them had ever seen with their own eyes until this moment. For 19 minutes, it seemed almost as though the plan might simply work. Brutal, costly, but survivable. Then the core answered. It was a second turning point in the cruelest. Dark energy lanced out from the structure itself in patterns no sense of predicted, and the human cruiser Halcyon Reach, flagship of the Northern Assault Line, carrying 1,100 crew, vanished in a burst of light that left no wreckage behind at all, as though the core had simply erased it from existence rather than destroyed it. All ships break formation. The core is armed directly. I say again, the core itself is a weapon. The transmission cut out mid-sentence. Panic threatened the combined fleet in a way 300 years of running from the Zios never had. Because running had at least been a plan the Korani understood. This was something else. A horror neither species had accounted for. An intelligence that could reach out and unmake a warship the size of a city in the space between one heartbeat and the next. It was Ilian, of all people, who found the answer, hunched over sensor data aboard the Windward with her hand shaking. The dark energy discharge. It isn't random. It has a cycle, a recharge pattern. Look, she fed the analysis directly to the Audacity's tactical display. There's a gap. 4 seconds every 90. It has to recover between shots. Rurk did not hesitate. All fleets on my mark. We go through the gap together. 4 seconds. If we're not past the discharge radius by the count, we die where we sit. Understood. There was no time for doubt, no time for the council debates that had shaped the Korani decision to come this far. 90 human ships and 22 remaining Korani vessels held position at the edge of the core's kill radius, engines burning, weapons silent, waiting on a 4-second window calculated by a cadet archivist who, 3 weeks earlier, had never fired a weapon in her life. "Mark," Rourke said. The combined fleet surged forward as one. Behind them, the core's dark energy lattice flared, discharged, and went dark exactly as Ilian had predicted. The shot passing to the space the fleet had occupied a heartbeat before, close enough that the solemn vigil shields buckled under the residual wave, but survivable. Barely. That was the third turning point of the battle. Not the discovery of the gap alone, but the moment 92 ships from two species that had known each other for less than a month trusted a single calculation with all of their lives, together, without hesitation. Ahead of them, breached and undefended in the 4-second window, the surface of the core lay open, and beneath it, visible now on every sense in the fleet, the pulsing, patient heart of the intelligence that had hunted the galaxy for 3 centuries. The breach in the core's surface was small, barely large enough for a single strike craft, and closing fast as the dark energy lattice began cycling back toward its next discharge. Valeria Rourke did not send a fleet through that gap. She went herself aboard a stripped-down assault shuttle carrying a payload built, in the human tradition now 3 generations old, from captured Zio's technology turned against its makers. Commander VTH. Her voice crackled over the open channel, stripped now of the composed calm she had worn since the moment they met. If this works, the core dies, and every Zio's vessel tied to across every front, everywhere, dies with it. If it doesn't, it will work, VTH said, and found she meant it. The shuttle vanished into the breach. For 11 seconds, the combined fleet held position in absolute silence, weapons trained on a structure the size of a small moon, waiting on a single woman's gamble. Then the core screamed. There was no other word for it. A discharge of light and energy that rippled outward from the structure's surface in concentric waves, not an explosion so much as an unmaking, as a lattice that had coordinated 3 centuries of slaughter convulsed and began, section by section, to go dark. Across the battlefield, without any weapon fire, without any further command, the 500,000 Zio's vessels of the garrison simply stopped. Engines idle, weapons silent. Machines that had hunted the Korani since before VTH's grandmother was born, drifting now like empty shells, their animating intelligence severed at the root. That was the first turning point of the ending. The moment the war did not end in one more battle, but in silence. The second turning point came harder. When the Audacity's recovery team finally reached the shuttle bay where Rourke's assault craft limped back through the breach, they found the captain alive, barely. The dark energy discharge had torn through her ship's shielding in the final seconds before detonation, and the woman who emerged from the wreckage bore burns that would mark her for the rest of her life. She did not complain of the pain. She only asked, before she would allow herself to be treated, whether the core's discharge pattern had registered across every Zio's front in the galaxy, or only this one. It had registered everywhere. Every front. Every world still under siege. In a single hour, a war that had lasted 2 centuries for humanity and 3 for the Korani simply ceased to exist. The cost of that hour would take much longer to reckon. Of 91 human warships, 31 did not return. Of 23 Korani vessels, 6 were lost in the final approach alone, among them the Windward, and with it, Ilian, the cadet archivist whose 4-second calculation had carried the entire fleet to the core's defenses. VDH stood at the memorial gathering 3 days later and could not find words adequate to the debt her people owed a girl who had never lived to see the war she ended. That was the third and final turning point. Not a battle, but a reckoning. Standing among the wreckage and the wounded, Rourke finally spoke aloud what she had carried since the moment her ship first found the Korani fleet dying among the stars. "You asked me once," she said to VDH, her burned hands wrapped carefully in medical wrapping, "why we came for you. The truth is, we almost didn't remember how. 200 years of fighting the Zios turned humanity into something that could win a war, and something that had nearly forgotten how to be anything else. We stopped grieving properly. We stopped celebrating anything. We built a fleet that could unmake 500,000 machines in an afternoon and called it necessary, but it cost us something we didn't notice was gone until the night we found your people dying, and some of us actually wept, Commander, for the first time in years." Because saving you reminded us there was still something in us worth saving. 2. VDH said nothing for a long moment, watching the stars beyond the observation window. Stars that no longer carried a certain promise of pursuit, of flight, of one more desperate escape. For the first time in 300 years, the Korani people had nowhere they needed to run to, because there was nothing left hunting them. Then, perhaps, VDH said finally, we did not only rescue each other from the Zios. Perhaps we rescued each other from what surviving them had cost. In the months that followed, the reconstruction began, slow, uneven, and unlike anything either species had built alone. Korani cartographers who had once mapped stars for the joy of knowing them began charting a galaxy no longer patrolled by machine hunters. Human engineers who had spent 2 centuries building weapons from captured Zios wreckage turned the same ingenuity toward rebuilding worlds instead of destroying fleets. Neither transformation was quick, and neither was complete. Some wounds, on both sides, would never fully close. But on the day the first joint human-Korani settlement broke ground on a world neither species could have reclaimed alone, Commander VTH stood beside Valeria Rurk and watched a generation of children, Korani and human alike, running across open ground beneath a sky with nothing left in it to fear. The galaxy had not been saved by superior weapons, though those had been necessary. It had not been saved by ancient knowledge alone, though that too had mattered more than anyone could have guessed. It had been saved, in the end, by a single decision made twice. Once by a woman who chose to stop and help a dying people she owed nothing to, and once by a commander who chose to trust strangers her own people had once dismissed as beneath notice. Renewal, it turned out, asked for nothing more than that, and nothing less.